This would be a much better conversation if I could take my notes out of this bag. It's not worth the effort at this stage. Thank you. Well, you and I have the pleasure of spending almost an hour with one of the consequential journalists and writers in America today. His journalism skills are represented by a Pulitzer Prize. His book skills are represented by another Pulitzer Prize. We were just talking about the beginning of his career, which was with a very small newspaper in Pittsburgh, Kansas. And he went from there to Kansas City and then to Washington, became the bureau chief in Germany for the Washington Post, which was quite appropriate because he was born in Munich. His father was in the military, and he had the advantage, or many people consider it a disadvantage, of spending a good portion of his life moving from one base to the next. Whatever, we are very happy to have him here. Good man, great skill. Did the impact of being raised on bases or in the military environment have any impact in your decision to write about the Great War of World War II?
Oh, thanks for that question. First of all, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here sitting with you, one of the great names in American journalism. Yeah, man, I think there's no doubt about that. My father had enlisted in the Army in 1942, December 1942. After he turned 18, he was in Europe with the constabulary, which was a unit that had been organized to enforce law and order after the war ended in 1945. He came back, he went to college, and then he went back into the Army, and so he spent the rest of his career. He just died in October at the age of 94, so he spent the rest of his career in the Army, and I grew up in the Army as a consequence. And I think that that experience, first of all, gave me an understanding of the culture of the military. It was the only culture that I knew until I was 17. And World War II certainly was a presence. When you grew up on Army posts in the 1950s and 1960s, it was all around you. All of my father's friends were World War II veterans. It infused the culture of the American Army, sometimes I think to the detriment of the United States Army, because there was a presumption that firepower and overwhelming force was a solution to virtually any military problem. And but for me, having grown up in it, knowing the language, speaking the language, I think it was a natural progression when I went into journalism. My first day at the Washington Post, which was November 1983, a guy named Len Downey, who later became the executive editor, succeeded Ben Bradley, who had hired me. And Downey was then the national editor. He came up to me and said, we know you're an Army brat. We know you know the difference between an F-16 and an M16. We want you to go right now. This is the first morning. Right now to Hunter Army Airfield outside of Savannah, because there's a general who's going to hold a press conference tomorrow morning about what happened in Grenada. The invasion of Grenada had been about 2 weeks earlier. Almost no information had come out whatsoever. Reporters had been banned from going on that invasion. And so I flew to Savannah and went to Hunter Army Airfield the next morning, and the two-star general at that time stood up there with his famous pointer. His name was H. Norman Schwarzkopf. And he had been the ground commander of the invasion of Grenada, and he did his Schwarzkopf thing, 3-hour briefing to reporters, and laid out much more information than had come out previously. And so I got typecast a bit after that, having the story led the paper the next day. And I did lots of military-related stories while I was at the Post as a consequence. And it was a natural fit for me. I'm very comfortable around soldiers.
You also had a time with another significant American general,
Petraeus, yes. Yes, yeah, significant in his own mind, certainly. I say that lovingly. Yes, well, I was. I'd written the first volume on World War II, An Army at Dawn, which is about the American role in the invasion of North Africa with the British in 1942-43. And I was between books, and I saw Don Graham, who's then the owner of the Washington Post, for breakfast one morning. And he said, if you're interested in coming back to the mothership for a brief period before you launch into the next book, why don't you think about going to Iraq? Or to, actually, at that point, it was going to Kuwait. And this was December of 2002. And I said, okay, I'm up for an adventure. So I decided that I needed to shop for the right unit to go with. At that time, I was 50 years old. I didn't want to go with a rifle company. I was too old for that. And I had met Petraeus. I knew him socially a bit. We're exactly the same age. He's a week older than I am. And I called him. He had just taken over command of the 101st Airborne Division at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. And I said, can I come down and talk to you about going to Kuwait if the division's deployed? And he said, as Petraeus always does, sure, come on. So I went down, and the next thing I know, I'm off to Kuwait with him, and I'm embedded with him personally. And I'm at his side all day, every day, from the time we got to Kuwait, through the invasion of Iraq, up the western shore of the Euphrates, little firefights in places like Karbala and Najaf, through the conquest of Baghdad. Well, the first day when we flew into Iraq, there was a terrible sandstorm that hit as we were flying from Kuwait into Iraq, halfway there. The worst storm I've ever seen. I was scared to death, and so was he. I will admit it. He will not. And we landed in a place called FOB Shell, Forward Operating Base Shell. There was graffiti on the outhouse that said, the only difference between this place and the moon is a little gravity. And bad news started coming in right away. Bad news, there'd been a young female private first class who'd been kidnapped. There had been an attack aviation mission the previous night, and the helicopters had been shot to pieces. That night, the 101st Airborne was supposed to launch their own attack helicopter mission. There were several other pieces of bad news. And Petraeus and I were standing outside, wind howling, swirling around us, our faces 6 inches apart. And he said to me, tell me how this ends. Tell me how this ends. Well, that became a signature phrase, right question. We're still asking ourselves that question. It became a signature phrase for the whole endeavor. So yeah, I spent a lot of time with him, got to know him, warts and all, and I still see him quite often. I think highly of him. He's a very talented, complicated man.
Your first book, if I am correct, is based on the West Point graduating class of 1966.
That's right.
Which is unique because, if I remember this, so many of the class were lost in Vietnam.
Yes.
How did you get into the book? And what was the emotional toll of going into the lives of all those young men?
Yeah, I love talking about them. It was like having 579 older brothers for me. My father, Army officer, had a closest friend who'd been his company commander when my father commanded a platoon in Salzburg when I was born. And that closest friend, named Red Fuller, became a 3-star general, has a son, Mike Fuller. And Mike was a member of the West Point class of 1966. And in The summer of 1981, I was just getting ready to move from Kansas City to Washington. Mike became president of Sprint after he left the Army. And we drove to my brother's wedding in the remotest part of Kansas. And for 3 hours, Mike spilled out the story of his West Point class to me. How they had been the leaders of their generation in July 1962 when they showed up at West Point. They'd gone charging off to war, all of them gone off to war after graduating in 1966. They were shot to pieces, you're right, they lost more men than any other West Point class. 30 of them were killed in Vietnam and Cambodia. And they come back from Vietnam as platoon leaders and then as company commanders, because many of them did 2 tours. And they're no longer leaders of their generation, they're pariahs within their generation. The country has changed in fundamental ways. It's a very disorienting thing for them. They stampeded out of the Army. They had a 4-year commitment in exchange for the free education the government had given them. And when those 4 years were up in 1970, so many men quit that the Army commissioned a study called Why They Quit, Resignations from the West Point Class of 1966. And they quit for the reasons you would think. They didn't see a future in that Army. They didn't see, they were traumatized by what had happened to them, not just in combat, but by the whole Megillah that had fallen on them. For me, and then they had many adventures and tragedies subsequently. For me, being admitted to their circle, for them to tell me their deepest, darkest anxieties and secrets and failings and aspirations that had not come true, was a remarkable slice of American social history, which is how I try to tell the book. It's a 25-year social history of America. It's traumatizing only in the sense that they're all in their mid-70s, except for the dead. And now they're dying off of old age. And I always think of them as 18-year-olds showing up on our day, reception day at West Point in July 1962. And that is a harder and harder image to sustain when you look at them. They're in their mid-70s, and so the hardest part for me is to see them age and die. But I still remain, I went to their 15th reunion, their 20th reunion, their 30th reunion, and their 40th reunion. I missed the 50th, but I see them individually and collectively a lot, and they have remained for me a pole star of sorts. I admire them enormously for the vicissitudes that they overcame, for their ability. The class was split in half by Vietnam. So if you've been to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, the wall, that was built by guys from the class of 1966. There was a young former enlisted man, Jan Scruggs, who was a public face, but the people who organized it, and in particular one guy named Jack Wheeler, who'd gone to West Point and then to Harvard Business School, Yale Law School, and Jack was the force behind it. Jack is dead now. He was murdered in Wilmington a few years ago. The most outspoken opponent of what he called a black gash of shame, of Maya Lin's extraordinary design. The most outspoken opponent of that design was Jack Wheeler's West Point, not only his classmate, his company mate, Tom Carhart. And Tom would denounce it as an open urinal, a black gash of shame. So they picked sides. And in that process of deciding how to honor the dead, first of all, they fought it out with each other. And then they subsequently came back together and found each other again. It's an amazing story. The trajectory of their story is something I could talk about all day, but I won't talk about it anymore now. Thank you.
Let me leap ahead a bit and be a bit personal. My wife has a grandson who is hoping to be admitted this year to either Annapolis or West Point. What did the Army learn from the experiences of the class of '66, and has it been valuable?
That's a really good question. The Army learned, first of all, that if you're going to have a military academy, you ought to have girls there. There were no women in '66. Women were not admitted until the classes of 1980. For one thing, it makes the men behave better. It makes them behave like men and not boys. So that was an important thing. The Army, they were dragged kicking and screaming, but so there are women there now, and there are blacks there now, and other minorities. In the West Point class of 1966, 579 men graduated, 3 blacks, no women. That's not America. So the military academies, and they've been forced to do this, but they've done it, they've saluted, and they've done it the right way, have made themselves more representative of the country in meaningful social ways. They've learned that treating young men and women who are going to be officers as adults is important. You don't treat them as children, which is how they were treated in the 1960s. It learned that for them to be effective combat officers, you've got to do more than teach them how to march. Class of 66, graduate June 1966, they could march really well. They couldn't do anything else. They were not, because the Army had such a compulsion, such a need at that time for young officers, particularly platoon leaders, in a platoon leaders war, they skipped basic class. So if you were an infantryman, you didn't go to learn how to be an infantry officer at Fort Benning. If you were an artilleryman, you did not go in 1966 to Fort Sill to learn how to be an artilleryman. Tankers did not go to Fort Knox. You don't need that. You're West Pointers. That's why 30 of them died. You know, they were thrown into something they had no idea what they were doing, in many cases. So the Army learned that. The Army does not do that anymore. It treats them as they should be treated, precious commodities who are absolutely as valuable as any other precious commodity that we could possibly have in this country. So they've learned a lot.
I was in Vietnam in 65 and 66 as a journalist. And I recall when a major military group came in, and you would go out with, various units, and the officers were thoroughly incompetent. And the only way to have security was to stay close to a sergeant.
Yeah.
And it was a little bit terrifying.
Yeah. I don't think that was uncommon then.
That you have a positive sense of improvement is reassuring.
I do.
But let's move on. Let's move on to World War II. My biggest memory of World War II was when I was 9, and I lived on a very middle-class street in a steel town in Ohio. And the eldest boy across the street, the youngest boy was my closest friend. The eldest boy had volunteered, and off he went, became a captain, and was killed in Germany. And in those days, you probably know far more about this than I do, the homes where there was a child off in the military would have a flag in the window. And there were symbols for how many children you had in the military. And there was the most frightening of all symbols, which was the symbol that you had lost a child in the war.
A gold star.
A gold star. And, having seen all the war movies, I suddenly was face to face with the reality of people not coming back.
Yeah.
As you went into this, what has become virtually somewhat of a lifetime engagement, how do you end up coping with the constant loss that you're writing about? The death of all these men who in many ways were the drivers of success and also the drivers of story.
Yes. Well, I don't try to avoid it. I find that as a writer, it's a propulsion system. The United States was lucky. We lost 1/3 of 1% of our population in the war, compared to the Russians, who lost 14% of their population during the war. That doesn't mean that the 400,000 American deaths weren't just as vital and as searing as any other deaths. The war was awful to the very end. There were 11,000 American soldiers killed in action in Germany in April 1945, the last full month of the war in Europe. That's almost as many as were killed in June of 1944, the month of invasion. It was horrible. The whole damn thing was horrible. And studying it in the aggregate can tell you that it's horrible, but it's when you get down to those individual deaths, those deaths that are as unique as a snowflake or a fingerprint, that you really, I think, understand what the war meant, what the war cost, what the consequences of the war were to individual families, and what the consequences should be for the country. Why 75 years later we're still talking about it. We should not shy away from it as a republic, and as an author, I find those individual stories, and many of them are not heroic. You get killed because you're in a plane crash, or you get killed because the moron next to you has pulled the trigger and accidentally shot you. You get killed in lots of ways that don't involve throwing yourself on a grenade to save your buddies, and for which you're awarded the Medal of Honor. So there are many tawdry deaths in addition to the 291,000, among the 291,000 combat killed in action deaths. And yet each of them is a sacrifice. Each of them is a grieving mother. Each of them is a hole in somebody's heart. Each of them is a hole in an individual family. And that stays with me whether I'm writing about, I'm now writing about the American Revolution, and I'm trying to find that same emotional resonance from 1776 that I find very easily in 1944.
Let's stay with World War II and the army that this nation assembled. I heard you once do, in effect, a profile of the American army, and I was just astounded because it's so different, I think, than the army today in every respect.
Yeah.
What was that army like in 1941?
Yeah, that's true, Van. It's, there's no comparison. First of all, it was a draft army. The United States was drafting 11,000 young men into the Army and Navy every day in 1944. That's 4 million a year. You didn't have a choice like you have today.
How big were they?
They were, I can tell you, the average GI was 5'8", and he weighed 144 pounds. And the reason that they're so scrawny is because they've just come out of the Depression. So in the talk this morning, I mentioned the fact that when the draft first started, you had to have, of your original natural 32 teeth, when the draft started, you had to have at least 12. By 1944, how many do you have to have? 0. And part of that is because of the absolute demand for manpower. And part of the reason that you're able to handle that, if you're part of the United States Army, is you've drafted a third of all the dentists in the United States and put them in uniform. And they're able to pull teeth, fill teeth, create dentures to allow those soldiers to masticate the Army ration. So they're not only physically smaller. I mean, if you had an average row of GIs here from 1944, and soldiers today, first of all, there'd be women in that group, and you don't go to war without them these days, and they'd just be physically more imposing than that group over there. Better educated. It's not unusual to find young enlisted men who've got college degrees today, or working on college degrees, or aspirations to get college degrees. 1 out of 3 of those soldiers in that 1944 group have only a grade school education. Only 1 out of 10 has even a semester of college. The officers you mentioned in Vietnam, well, imagine what this crowd is like. Officers who are in command of a platoon of 40 men or a company of 160 men, and they don't know what they're doing. And just like the Vietnam officers, if they're smart, they're clinging to some smart, savvy, competent, non-commissioned officer who's, "Sir, I'm going to get you through this." So it's not only are they 2 or 3 generations removed from today's soldiers, they're removed in many ways. It's quite a sea change that's happened.
This is not salacious, but did you say there was a high VD rate in that army?
There was a high VD rate among those who were getting drafted. There were, the Army was drafting 12,000 VD patients a month by 1944. When the draft first started, if you had syphilis, you're not going to go in the Army. You have gonorrhea, you're not going in the Army. 1944, you got syphilis? We got just the thing for you, pal. It's called penicillin. And penicillin, great discovery, the antibiotic agent by British scientists in the 1920s. By the 1940s, the British and the Americans have an industrial process to make something that had been created by the gram, and now we're making it by the kilogram and eventually by the ton. And that penicillin is the reason that 12,000 VD patients a month, most of them syphilitic, are being drafted by 1944. It's a precious commodity, incidentally, penicillin, even if you're making kilograms and eventually tons of it, to the point where the decision had to be made. It went all the way, I think, Anthony, to Churchill was involved in this, over whether or not we were going to use precious penicillin to treat potential gas gangrene victims who were wearing German uniforms. In other words, you've got a dying German soldier, he's got gangrene, are you going to give him some of your penicillin to combat that? The decision was sometimes. So, yes, they were drafting VD patients, they were drafting stutterers, they were drafting obsessive compulsives, they were drafting, I talked about this a little bit earlier, you could be drafted if you were 2400 vision, as long as it was correctable 20/40 in one eye. You could be drafted if you were missing a thumb and 3 fingers on one hand, including your trigger finger. So that gives you an idea of the absolute compulsion to get every possible soul you can in uniform, because even in a country as big as the United States then, 130 million people, were running out. The Brits did run out. Brits were absolutely out of men. And so, if you've got a problem with stuttering, no, we'll fix that for you. Just keep your mouth shut.
Now, you're writing now about the War of a Revolution.
Yes.
How do you find material that is as extensive and deep as the material is for World War II?
Yeah.
How are you finding all those marvelous human stories from X number of centuries ago?
Yeah. It's quite different, man. You're right. First of all, you had 16 million in uniform in World War II. They were mostly literates, or at least subliterate, and they kept diaries, they wrote letters, and some of them were remarkably literate. Some of the great literary minds of our country were in uniform in World War II. So there's a vast trove of stuff. Also, it's the most documented event in human history, World War II. And the archives are stupendous. Just the United States National Archives in College Park alone has more stuff than any human being in an entire lifeline can possibly begin to get through. The revolution is quite different. It's much smaller. Washington's army is never more than 25,000. He has under his command, when things are going great, he's got the equivalent of about a division and a half by World War II standards. They're sort of literate, some of them, but many of them are, the spelling and if 1 out of 3 of the World War II cadre are grade school educated, you can imagine what it's like for the Revolutionary War crowd. There are, despite all of that, amazing things to find. And I think, any narrative writer who's really willing to burrow into the archives and be an archive rat can find those things. I spent, just one example, Queen Elizabeth, bless her heart, opened the papers of George III, all 4 Georges actually, but George III dominates them, 2 years ago. They'd been locked up basically. They'd been given out in drips and drabs to official court biographers and that sort of thing. So the Queen was persuaded to open these up to scholars, and I was one of the first in, and they're kept in the Round Tower, begun by William the Conqueror at Windsor Castle. So I spent a month there with George's papers, and George was his own secretary until late in life, writing not only the copies of his correspondence, but the copies. He would make the copies himself. He was very compulsive. He was a great list maker. He would write recipes for insecticide, tincture of whatever. And going to the Round Tower every day for a month, climbing the 119 stone steps and then the 21 wooden steps to the garret of the Round Tower, and having the papers there in front of you in George's hand, which is quite legible, gave me certainly a feeling that this is a man I now know a lot better than I would have thought that I could know him. It also gave me an affection for him. That
in what way affection?
Well, Americans tend to caricature him as kind of, if you've seen Hamilton, the king sings 3 songs and he's a buffoon. Well, George was not a buffoon. He's running the world's greatest empire. He's got a wife he loves, an obscure, drab German princess he married 6 hours after he met her. They have 15 kids. She's churning out children with lunar regularity, and he's quite a good father. And you see the letters to the children. You see the instructions to the tutors. You see his care about the family. You see his care about the kingdom, about the empire. One strategic error that he makes is he has come into the empire. He becomes king in 1760 when his grandfather dies. His father's already dead. And it's right toward the end of what we call the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, and it's when the first British Empire was created. They get Canada, they get 1 billion acres to the west of the Alleghenies, they get parts of India. The Brits do well for themselves in that treaty, and it's an empire. George is convinced that if the colonies slip away, it's the beginning of the end of the empire. If America goes, Canada will go. Ireland will go. It's the domino theory. He believes, if Vietnam goes, then it's Thailand. It's exactly the domino theory, 18th century style. And he absolutely is convinced of this. Lord North, his first minister, the prime minister, believes it. They all believe it. All of the king's men believe this in their hearts. It's why they fight for 8 years against their own people, transatlantically, across 3,000 miles of open ocean in the age of sail. That's really, really hard to do. So I have an affection for him because, first of all, with 200 and some years of retrospection, I can see that he's wrong. But I can also see that he's wrong because he cares a lot. He cares a lot about what it is he's inherited, about what it is he's trying to hold together. So, I love writing about him, and the first book will be out in May. So,
what is the book about?
It's the first in God help me, another trilogy on the American Revolution. This book covers from the beginning of the Revolution, Lexington and Concord, through the Battle of Princeton, which is January of 1777. It's a battle history told from both sides, really. And drawing on my deep, long understanding of the American Army. This is one of the reasons I was interested in doing it, was because I spent so much time with the Army, latter-day Army, including the World War II Army. I wanted to see where they came from.
Who is a hero of the American Army that you have discovered?
Of the American Army, the Revolutionary period?
The Revolutionary
period.
period.
Well,
who have you got that's a surprise to you?
Well, the greatest combat leader for either side is Benedict Arnold. Now, his heroism gets tarnished, to say the least, but in the beginning of the war, the first couple of years of the war, he is a man made to lead other men in the dark of night. He's an extraordinary combat leader, not only terrestrially. He knows how to fight at sea. When the British are invading and threatening New York, and they come down Lake Champlain, who do they call on to create and fight the fleet on Lake Champlain to stop them? Benedict Arnold. Why? Because he's been a merchant in Connecticut. He had a small merchant fleet. He knows how to sail. He knows how to build ships. He knows everything about it, and he knows how to fight. So he's an extraordinary figure. Now, there are others, Nathaniel Greene. I didn't discover him, but here's a guy. He's from a family of anchor smiths in Rhode Island. They're Quakers. He gets kicked out of the Friendship Society because either he's been seen in a tavern or because he's called to arms. He's a man born to fight. And he becomes maybe the greatest battle leader of the American army of the 18th century.
Wow.
Yeah, he's much better than a Washington. Yeah. Washington has great skills, but not as a tactician. Washington, kind of like Eisenhower, is an indifferent tactician. Greene he stumbles around a bit at first, but Greene he's a real general.
Okay, I'm going to ask you three more questions, and then if there are questions from out there, if you have velocity, because I don't think there are any microphones, we'd love to get a couple questions from the group. But my first thing for you is, go back to World War II. What are your two most admired novels of the Second World War?
My two most admired novels.
That you thought really captured World War II?
Yeah. I'm not much of a novel reader these days, to be honest with you.
I was going to tilt to Norman Mailer.
I was thinking of Norman Mailer too, and I haven't read that since in 30 years. Does it hold up? I mean, I would say Catch-22 would be. It's not a World War II novel per se, but it's set in World War II, and it reflects Joseph Heller's experiences. And it is a novel of the time, but with a contemporary sensibility, meaning it recognizes the absurdity of it all, and it is searing in its denunciation of the waste of war. So I think Catch-22 is one.
Okay, let me move you from that to the movies. You
12
have
o'clock,
a favorite World War II movie?
12 O'Clock High. I think 12 O'Clock High is a real...
Gregory Peck?
Yeah. Gregory Peck as a colonel who's got what we today call PTSD. And it's a really searing study in leadership and the difficulties of leadership. Another wonderful movie, I think, from the other side of the hill is Das Boot. That's a terrific book, terrific movie. If you've seen that, it's about a German submarine movie. It's very well done.
Well, there's a lady back there.
Since you started on the greatest, what's your greatest story of heroism?
My greatest story of heroism in World War II? Well, there are lots of stories, as I alluded to earlier, of young men throwing themselves on hand grenades. Fortunately, I say lots, but there are enough that you look at those and you think, my God. So those always move me. But I think, in some sense, the greatest soldier of the war is Franklin Roosevelt. Now, this is a guy who's never heard a shot fired in anger. And yet, he's making decisions as a commander-in-chief that are so extraordinarily fraught and so extraordinarily consequential, so that when he makes a decision, for example, to support the British with Lend-Lease, when he makes a decision to press for a renewal of the draft, which passes incidentally by one vote in Congress, there's a sequence of decisions that he makes that are all difficult, all politically perilous. To me, those are acts of heroism. I lived with Franklin Roosevelt for 15 years doing that trilogy. I know what he was suffering. I know what he was suffering physically. When you see him at Yalta, for example, in February 1945, and he's got 2 months to live, and the things that he is struggling with at Yalta, and we can argue about whether he made right decisions or wrong decisions, and yet he's still struggling as a soldier struggles. To me, that's a kind of heroism that sticks with me.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Rick, I volunteered for the Army. I served twice, and I say that to just pose this question. I, for one, maybe among many, not sure, support a draft military. The draft being in two parts. You can serve militarily or civilian, but you will serve. What's your opinion of a draft army in today's world, given the technology, et cetera, that is at hand?
Could you hear him back there? He said he'd volunteered for the Army, served. He wanted to know basically what my opinion is of a draft army as applied to today's circumstances. He favors a draft, not necessarily going to the military, but some sort of public service as an alternative. What do I think about that? You'd be hard-pressed to find a single military leader who thinks a draft army is a good idea, first of all. And the reason for that is it's a lot easier to work with somebody who's volunteered to be where they are, whether it's at Fort Bliss, Texas, or in some hellhole in Afghanistan, if they volunteered to be there. So there is a great resistance within the structures of the military to the idea of any kind of resumption of conscription. Personally, I agree with you. I think that public service of some sort of commitment would be a good thing. I think it would be, is it politically possible? Probably not. Is it a nightmare to organize? Probably. But I do think that, among other things, it would be a way to, a method of cohesion. I suspect that you found that in your experiences in the military. You met other people who were from different parts of the country and from different social strata and so on. And I think that that's important at a time when, we seem to be having trouble finding any common ground at all. So I think as a practical matter for filling the military ranks, it's not a good idea right now, unless you need to expand the Army and the other services considerably. And we're going the other way now. The United States Army is less than 500,000.
Okay, yes.
We've been at war now, one way or another, for about 20 years, mostly unsuccessfully. To what extent is that a problem with civilian leadership setting unrealistic objectives and so forth? And to what extent is that a U.S. military problem in terms of its leadership and strategic?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, he said we've been at war now for the better part of 20 years, certainly since 9/11 in a meaningful way, and mostly unsuccessfully. To what extent is that because of civilian leadership shortcomings, and to what extent is that through military shortcomings? I don't think it's either or there. First of all, I think you'd have to also throw in, to what extent is it a shortcoming of the Republic? To what extent are we, as a people, responsible for supporting the military objectives that our elected leaders have chosen? Have we chosen the right elected leaders in the decisions that they've made? Without being too facile about it, I think that it's easy to say that we failed. In Afghanistan, in Iraq, spent a fair amount of time in the Gulf War over there, and again with Petraeus on the 101st, and in places like Somalia. I was in Somalia 3 times. I was in Bosnia twice. And it's easy to say, well, that just didn't work out well. Somalia, You remember that catastrophe. And yet, I think you have to define victory before you can define defeat or failure. So if we say that our objectives militarily, our political military objectives, are to basically protect the homeland, to preserve the way of life that we've got, to preserve the freedom of action and so on that we enjoy, then I don't think you can so easily dismiss the military actions that we've got so far. Everybody looks pretty comfortable here to me. I don't see the weight of war on too many shoulders here in this valley. And so I think that, before we begin to assess blame for failure, I think we should think clearly about what it is that we intended to do when we sent soldiers to Afghanistan starting in 2001, when we sent soldiers to Iraq in 2003, which was a mistake, no doubt about that, and that was a political mistake. And when we send soldiers to places like Syria, what is it that we're trying to do? What is our objective here? Is it to conquer Syria? Of course not. It's to keep them away. And so I think it becomes more complicated when you look at it from that standpoint.
Rick, thank you. It's what a marvelous 45 minutes.
Thank you.